As a mid-handicap golfer, I recently swapped out my £270 TaylorMade hybrid for this, the Takomo 101U driving iron, which costs just £129. Good decision? Watch on to find out. Hello everyone, welcome back to the channel and to my second ever club review video. If you haven't seen it already and are interested, then I did a previous review of the Takomo 101 irons, which you can see here. But today I'm going to be talking about the 101U driving or utility iron. Now, like a lot of golfers, previously I have had at the top of my bag a driver, a 3-wood, and then a hybrid, which has been a TaylorMade QI10 Max 3 hybrid with 20 degrees of loft. Now, I kind of bought this just because that was what I thought you were supposed to have at the top of your bag, and I didn't get fitted for it, which was probably a mistake. But as a sort of mid to high handicap golfer, hybrids being easier to hit and more forgiving, I assumed this was the way to go. And at first it was fine. I didn't hit it a lot, but it was okay. It was kind of as good as most of the other clubs in my bag in terms of dispersion and forgiveness and hitability and things like that. But as my swing has changed and as I have gotten a little bit better as a golfer, I fell out of love with this club. Like a lot of players, I had a bit of an issue with this just seemingly going left. It wasn't something that was happening across my bag, but this just seemed to want to hook, and I am not for a minute going to blame the club. I'm sure it's absolutely fine, but in terms of the match between my swing and the club, it just wasn't working for me to the point that I stopped hitting it. So I decided that rather than just have an idle spot in my bag and effectively be playing with 13 clubs, I should change it. And so because I have had such a good time with the Takomo 101 irons, and because generally I am pretty confident when hitting my irons, I decided to move to this, which is the Takomo 101U driving iron. Now, I bought this in the 2-iron spec, which I don't know the loft of. Now, I bought this in the 2-iron spec, which means it is 18 degrees of loft, so it's slightly stronger than the hybrid, but obviously it doesn't have the same kind of mass and necessarily the same distance as a 20-degree hybrid would. But I wanted to move towards something that hopefully was going to kind of stop the left miss, and frankly that I was going to have a little bit more confidence in. As I say, I'm sure there is nothing wrong with that hybrid club itself, but it got to the point where I had no confidence hitting it, so it became a self-fulfilling prophecy that I would hit it badly, and so effectively there just became no point in even having it out there with me. So I made the change recently to the Takomo 101U driving iron in the 2-iron loft, and today I'm going to run through what I have thought of the club. So first place to start, as I did with the Takomo 101s themselves, is with looks, and as you can see and as you can tell, it is a very, very good looking club, as all of the Takomo products are. It is pretty much exactly the same sleek minimalist design as the Takomo 101s themselves. You know, there's no bold branding, there's no plates or screws or anything crazy on the back. It's just simple, it's clean, it's minimalistic as the Takomo products are, and I really do like the look of it. Now, the two big differences are the sole is very, very wide, which is pretty typical with a driving or utility iron, but it certainly is a chunky club, and when you look down on it at the bag, there is no missing it. And then the other thing, which is obviously more about performance than aesthetics, but does separate it from the irons I have in my bag, is it comes with a hybrid graphite shaft rather than a steel shaft, so it does look slightly different from that perspective. One of the other changes, and I don't necessarily have a good way to verify this, but it just feels that way to me, is got a thicker grip. Certainly in my hand, this feels like a thicker grip than any of the other irons in my bag, like noticeably so, which is not necessarily a problem, and I'm sure it's intentional, but it's just something to know if you are interested in this club. It will sit kind of thicker in the hands than the rest of the irons in your bag do. Now, also worth noting, as is the case with the Takomo clubs on the whole, there's no fitting process for this. You just get the club you get, and what that means in terms of shaft selection is you need to base it off either the distance you hit certain clubs in your bag or your swing speed. Now, for me, that put me in the 80 gram S shaft, so stiff flex. I don't actually know if I'd be better off with an X stiff or a regular stiff, but this is what the site recommended, so this is what I have gone with. As I said, it is sort of a fair comparison in as far as I didn't actually get fitted for the hybrid. I did the same thing there, just basing it off swing speed and distance. So I haven't been fitted for either of these clubs, but they should be fairly apples to apples in terms of comparison because of that. Now, I have had this in the bag for a little while now, but it is a club with a fairly specific use case, so I haven't hit it a ton. What I will say is that it feels good when you hit it well, and it feels pretty bad when you hit it badly. I would say more so than the 101 irons themselves on the bad end, but it doesn't necessarily feel quite as good on the good end with those centered strikes. It is just a little bit more of that kind of bone trembling feel when you catch it a bit thin, even more so than the other irons in the bag. I think part of that is because this is so low lofted, it is quite hard to hit well and get it up in the air. And so if you do catch one a bit thin or a bit off the toe, you do know about it in your hands, and it can leave you a bit stingy. The good strikes though do feel good. I've hit this a few times absolutely out of the center of the club, and it has felt excellent, and I will come to the performance in a minute, but I do like the feel of it. It is essentially a continuation of the 101 iron set, obviously aesthetically just that thicker sole and the hybrid shaft, but the feel isn't drastically different from the other irons, as you would expect, this being part of that 101 family. One thing I will say, just for complete clarity, is that I haven't hit any other driving irons in the past. I have hit other iron sets, irons that I owned before the 101s or other players' irons that I've hit, but I have no basis for comparison for a utility or driving iron. So I don't know if the feel of this compares favorably or unfavorably, or is just fairly typical for a club of this type. I will say, as far as I'm concerned, it feels pretty much as I would expect it to. Good out of the center, pretty bad when you're hitting it kind of heel or toe or catching it a bit thin, but certainly no complaints in the feel department from my usage of it so far. Now, of course, the most important thing is performance, and the reason I bought this club in the first place was because I wasn't happy with the performance of my hybrid, most of all the dispersion. The strike was generally okay, I could obviously get it up in the air and it would go a fair distance, but I was really battling that left miss, and sometimes in trying to counter that left miss, I would bring in the right miss. So really the dispersion with that club was just to the point that I couldn't trust it and therefore didn't even hit it. Has that changed with this? Yes, actually. In terms of lateral dispersion, I have found things have been much improved with this. Obviously, it is possible to miss if you leave the face open or shut it down, it is going to go offline, but I would say I have more confidence hitting this on, say, a narrow short par 4 or a long par 3, that I am going to at least keep it within the bounds of the course and not see a kind of searing rope hook out of bounds left or flare one right in trying to battle that. So I do feel better stepping up and hitting this club in those scenarios, and just being able to do that, being able to feel like I now have a 14th club in the bag, has been a positive development. I suppose the counter argument against driving irons in general, and something that I have found with this, is that I don't necessarily hit it as well in terms of strike quality as I did with the hybrid. It doesn't have the same mass behind the club head, it doesn't have the same level of forgiveness, and I am not getting it up in the air and flushed quite as consistently as I did with the hybrid. As I say, that is to be expected. It is an iron, it is slightly lower lofted, and so it was always going to be slightly more difficult from that perspective. But I would say that is more than counteracted by the fact that I'm able to at least keep it on line much more consistently. And generally, I have been hitting this pretty well. I would say the strike quality isn't necessarily as good as that in terms of, number out of 10 that I pure, but it's also not bad. And there is definitely enough forgiveness and enough help in the design of this club that I'm hitting it well, at least as often or more often than I'm hitting it badly. As I say though, this is a club, as the hybrid is to some extent, with a fairly limited use case. I'm hitting this on kind of short, tight par 4s, long par 3s, and I am typically hitting it off the tee at the moment as opposed to off the deck, just because I haven't had brilliant success with it off the ground so far. So that's partly why I have brought it here to the sim, to try and do something of a more scientific test. I figure I can hit a lot more shots with it here in a short space of time than I could on the course. Might take me a month or so of rounds out there to hit this 20 times. So I thought I would come here and do a little bit of testing between the two clubs. So what I'm going to do is hop on the launch monitor now, hit a bunch of shots with this, hit a bunch of shots with the hybrid, and see what the distance and, more importantly, what the dispersion and strike consistency is between the two clubs. And then I will come back with my conclusions at the end. Okay, so that was an interesting and slightly tiring test of both the Takomo 101U driving iron versus the TaylorMade QI10 hybrid, and sort of thankfully it confirmed my suspicions from my on-course play over the past few weeks and months, and the data was fairly interesting. So the hybrid first was carrying kind of around 200, 205 on decent strikes, which is what I would typically expect, and then running out anywhere between 210, 220-ish, as I say, on the good strikes. But the dispersion was, as I have experienced over the last year or so on the course, pretty erratic, and the big left miss was very, very much in play. I wouldn't say loads and loads of my shots went searingly far left, but a few of them did, and the ones that were really bad would have been very much in trouble, or OB, or whatever it might have been, out on a real golf course. Now over to the Takomo 101U. That was slightly shorter on average when I was hitting it off the deck. The hybrid was pretty consistent in distance, whether it was off the deck or teed up very slightly. The Takomo 101U was about 10 yards shorter when I was hitting it off the deck, although when I teed it up, that difference in distance pretty much disappeared. It was maybe 5 yards shorter than the hybrid when teed up, but it was pretty similar. Wouldn't necessarily carry quite as far, but get a little bit more roll. So it was probably going around 200 carry and then rolling out to kind of 210-ish or 195 to 205, that kind of thing. So within 5 yards when teed up, but certainly not necessarily quite as far when I was hitting off the deck. That's probably more of a strike thing than anything to do with the club. However, as far as the dispersion goes, and that was the thing I was looking to improve in moving from a hybrid to a driving iron, that was definitely improved. Again, this tallies with what I've seen out on the course, but it was good to confirm it on a bunch more shots on the launch monitor. So obviously I'm a mid-handicap golfer. I don't hit every shot well. I do sometimes leave the club face open or close it down or whatever. So there was a dispersion cone out there, but it was certainly much narrower than with the hybrid. More of the shots were going down my target line or a few yards either side of it. And even the really, really bad ones were more or less on the course, brackets virtual driving range. None of them were kind of screaming into what would have been OB or someone's garden or a train track. Even the bad ones were kind of light or maybe slightly heavy rough, but playable were they to be out on a real course. And for the most part, everything was much more down the middle. Even when I didn't catch a shot well, it would kind of find its way up the fairway, more or less down the center. And again, it's the kind of shot that you wouldn't be pleased with out on the course, but wouldn't put you in any danger or blow up a card. A lot of this is down to the fact that it is, of course, an iron and doesn't have any gear effect like a wood or a hybrid would do. But it is good to know that the reason I bought the club is borne out by both my on-course anecdotal experience so far, and also the data I'm seeing here on the launch monitor. I would say the truism about hybrids for kind of mid and high handicap golfers, i.e. they are easier to hit, does ring true. The strike quality with the driving iron certainly wasn't as consistent, and it's not as easy to get it up in the air, and it's certainly not as easy to get it as far down as you might like to be hitting a hybrid. So that is true, and that is probably one pro in the column of the hybrid versus the driving iron. But for me, I am really looking for a club that I can hit at about that distance, but just have confidence that it's going to go in the right direction, whether that is on a particularly tight par 4 or a long par 3 or whatever it might be. And unfortunately, I just lost that confidence with my hybrid. So as far as the Takomo 101U goes, my impressions so far are very positive. Obviously, it looks great. It's fantastically well priced. It feels good when you're hitting it well. And again, that was something that was borne out by hitting a bunch more shots with it here in the simulator. And as far as dispersion data goes, on course and on the launch monitor so far, I would say signs are very, very positive. So I will keep playing with it. If you are someone who is looking for something in that portion of the top end of your bag, and you are maybe struggling with a hybrid that goes left, or just a club that you have lost confidence with, then perhaps trying out a driving iron from Takomo, or indeed anyone else, would be a good move. Thanks for watching. I hope you have found this interesting and useful. If you have, I would love it if you would consider subscribing to the channel and maybe liking the video as well. And if you have any thoughts or questions, please leave them below in the comments and I will get back to you, and I will see you in the next one.